In this video, we'll be exploring the topic of utilisation for the decedent population, considering how much healthcare is used, what types of healthcare, and how patterns of use vary by proximity to death. I'll be talking through some of the key analysis from our report, using the Midlands as an example. But all this information is available by STP in the STP level reports, and these also show STP comparisons to the Midlands. This is the third video in a series of 4, taking a short look at key themes from our report on end-of-life care in the Midlands. The full report for individual STPs and also a regional version are available at www.strategyunitwm.nhs.uk. And if you have any comments or queries, please feel free to get in touch. Before we look at the analysis, I just want to really briefly mention the data that's underpinning all of our end-of-life care report. We have access to mortality data, which is the information that's collected when a person dies and their death is registered. And we know from this that there were just over 93,500 adult deaths in the Midlands in 2018-19. Obviously, 2018-19 is a period which predates COVID. Therefore, throughout all of our analysis, there is no effect from COVID, and this represents a more normal or business as usual situation for end-of-life services. Data is linked for each deceased adult to their activity data occurring in the 2 years prior to their death, where activity data is available and also at a patient level. This gives a very granular linked patient level data set with a wealth of detail. This data is also available to your local analysts for them to access. If you would like us to arrange access to the data to help support any local supplementary questions that you may have, then please just contact us to arrange this. In our linked data, we have grouped activity into 4 different activity types, which we use throughout our reports. So, urgent service events, planned contacts, planned admissions, and bed days. And within these, there are a range of services included. So urgent service events, for example, includes emergency admissions, A&E attendances, and 111 calls. Looking now at the analysis, we start by looking at the use of urgent service events in the 2 years prior to death for Midlands decedents. In this chart, we're looking at this by proximity to death in days. We have the data points given the rate of activity by proximity to death. For example, as highlighted here, this shows the amount of activity taking place on day 0 or on the day on which a person dies. We have the curve that we've modelled through the data points to give a pattern of service use. And then in our report, we've looked to describe these curves in a very few short sentences. Here, for urgent service events, we say that they start low and increase slowly for much of the period. Then, in the few months prior to death, there is a rapid rate of increase, rising to a sharp peak. For the other activity types, there's a chance now to reflect on how their curves look. Here we have the other 4 activity types across the top. So, planned contacts, planned admissions, bed days, and critical care bed days. Each of the 4 charts, charts A to D, corresponds to one of the activity types. Before revealing which chart goes with which activity type, it might be worth taking just a brief moment to consider in your own mind what shape you would expect for each activity type. So, all is revealed. Bed days and critical care both have a similar shape to urgent service events in that they start low, increase slowly, and rise to a sharp peak on day 0. The reason behind this is that bed days and critical care bed days for the decedent population most often take place as a result of an emergency admission, something that we investigate in more detail in an earlier video around people and place, where we examine patient pathways. Planned admissions, they don't quite start from 0, but they start low and increase steadily over the 2-year period. They come to a rounded peak of use at around about 3 months before death, at which point use declines. Planned contacts start higher, from around 15 activities. They also increase steadily over the 2-year period, coming to a sharp peak of use a few weeks before death. So what does this mean? Well, it shows the intensity of use for Midlands decedents. It shows that urgent care and bed days and critical care stays associated with emergency care are most intense and most used when close to death. For both types of planned care, use grows throughout the 2 years but drops away in the months or weeks before death. The previous charts were for the Midlands, but here is an example of one of the STP charts. The example is for planned admissions. STP data points and STP curve are represented in yellow, and the Midlands curve is in grey. For this STP, the use of planned admissions on average starts higher than the Midlands, but as proximity to death reduces, their use declines, and around 9 months before death, there are fewer planned admissions per decedent when compared to the Midlands. In our report, we also consider how utilisation varies between the 5 different causes of death. For urgent care and bed days, although curves do differ, they're not wildly dissimilar. We would describe them in a very similar way. However, it stands out for both types of planned care, contacts and admissions, that the care of cancer patients dominates use. This is even though, as explored in an earlier video, cancer patients equate to only a fifth or 20% of all decedents. From our very detailed data, we can consider utilisation in different ways. The previous slides looked at utilisation for all decedents by proximity to death. Now here, we're still looking at utilisation, but we're doing this for each age at which a person dies. Age at death is on the horizontal axis here. We're no longer looking at it by proximity to death in days. Instead, we have 2 different time periods. The first year before death, so 0 to 12 months, and the second year before death, so 12 to 24 months. There are 2 reasons why we've considered age-specific utilisation. Firstly, to help understand how utilisation differs between the older and younger members of the decedent population. And secondly, we later apply age-specific utilisation to future decedent populations over the next 40 years to calculate future demand on services. On this first chart, which is at service level for A&E attendances, I will explain the chart in a little bit more detail to help understand how it works and to aid with interpreting this series of charts. As an example, this data point represents 67-year-olds, i.e. those in the Midlands who die aged 67. It shows how much activity they use in the first year prior to death, which is 2.2 A&E attendances on average. If we look at younger decedents, here those aged 52 when they die, then we can see that use is pretty similar. At the other end of the age spectrum, people dying aged 89, again have a similar level of A&E attendances. For the second year period in red, use of A&E attendances is again similar by age. It is, however, much lower than the first year period. So what does this tell us? It tells us how A&E is used by the decedent population. It tells us that what drives A&E attendances is not age, but proximity to death. We see a similar picture for emergency admissions. For 111 calls, utilisation is lower, but we do see here that after around about age 70, as age at death increases, so does use of this service. For planned contacts, the first thing we can see is that these are dominated by outpatient attendances. Mental health contacts are low, and there is a very small amount of IAT contacts. For outpatient attendances, there's a general picture of use declining as age increases. Also, the difference in use between the first year period and the second year reduces as age increases, so that for the very oldest decedents, there is little or no difference between the 2 periods. With mental health, although small, there's more of a wave picture where activity reduces for those people dying through their 50s and 60s, but with a slight increase after age 70. Some research shows that we are happiest by age 70, and it may well be that declining use up to this point is a reduction in the use of services around mental well-being, and the increase after this point to do with conditions such as Alzheimer's and dementia. Planned admissions, we can see that these are dominated by day case admissions, with small amounts of regular attendances and elective admissions. For day cases, as with outpatient attendances on the previous slide, there's a general picture of use declining as age increases, and the difference in use between years again reduces, so that the very oldest decedents, there is little or no difference between the 2 periods. Bed days. Bed days are dominated by bed days as part of an emergency admission. The older the decedent, the longer they spend in hospital. In the first year period, the very oldest are often spending around about 26 days in hospital. This is approximately a week longer than the youngest, who are staying around about 19 days. So we now know how much healthcare is used. We know this by age, and we also know the size of future decedent populations by age from prediction made available to us from ONS and examined more fully in an earlier video. In our report, we apply age-specific utilisation to future decedent populations over the next 40 years. This gives us the activity we can expect in future if utilisation remains the same as it is currently. Here, we see future demand for urgent services at 5-year intervals broken down by age group. You can see the older decedents, those aged 85 and over, dominate and also drive the increases in demand for this type of activity. And just to mention, the percentages here are showing the percentage increase when compared to 2020. For other activity types, the largest growth areas are in beds and planned contacts, with the growth in beds being particularly large. The move from 3.1 million bed days in 2020 in the Midlands to 3.3 million bed days would equate to an additional 556 beds being required by 2025. When comparing 2020 to 2030, so just a 10-year period, an additional 1,222 beds would be required in the Midlands by that point. So far, we've been considering use from the perspective of activity, but now we consider it from the perspective of cost or resource. We've been able to calculate costs for a large proportion of the activity that we have using a combination of national tariff or reference costs. And this shows us that the cost for the decedent population over the 2 years before they die are just over 1.3 billion. By activity type, it's clear that the majority of costs are in urgent care, which equate to 2/3 of the total budget. In our report, we also compare each SDP's average spend with that of the Midlands. Here, the average spend in the Midlands is just over £15,000 per decedent and represented by the vertical line on the chart. The horizontal bars show the average spend for each SDP from highest to lowest. However, calculating meaningful averages can be tricky. For example, if we have a very small sample, then it's difficult to be sure that an average value is truly representative. We therefore calculate confidence intervals, indicating the range in which we are confident the true value lies. If we look at SDPs 1 to 4, then their average spend is higher than the Midlands, and we can say that it is significantly higher. SDPs 5 and 6 have an average spend that is higher than the Midlands, but not significantly so. And the last 5 SDPs have an average spend that is significantly lower than the Midlands. This chart makes no judgments or give reasons as to why spend differs. This is just highlighting areas of variations that SDPs might like to understand more about. Thank you for watching this video investigating the final few weeks of end-of-life care. You can find the other videos in this series at www.strategyunitwm.nhs.uk. And again, if you'd like to get in touch, please email us at strategy.unit@nhs.net.